A lot of issues have already been raised this morning, and I think probably everybody has ideas they would like to communicate. We will be somewhat packed this afternoon. I will just speak for 20 minutes, and so the last 10 minutes, it's either questions or comments or anything else. We need to create some space for everybody, but there's so much demand on this conference that there's not a lot of open space. 1933, February or March, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the President of the United States, right in the middle of the most serious financial crisis the U.S. ever faced. In the previous 3 years, 6,000 U.S. banks had failed and closed. 6,000 banks had failed and closed within 3 years. The Reserve Bank and economists had tried every conceivable policy that they could think of at that time, and nothing had stemmed the intensity of the crisis. Americans were lined up at their banks every day to withdraw their money before their banks also failed. And of course, even the soundest bank in the world would fail if enough customers came and withdrew their money, because every bank lends out makes money only by lending out their money. FDR had gone to Harvard and taken courses on economics there, and he concluded that he hadn't learned anything in his economics course that prepared him to take over in this crisis that hadn't already been tried and failed. And finally, he closed the banks on the first day he became president, and he went on the radio 5 days later, and he addressed the American people, and he said, look, all of the capacities that have made America the most prosperous country in the world are still there. We have all the rich natural resources. We have all the talented, skilled, aspiring people. We have all of the plant and machinery and factories that made us a prosperous nation. But something we have lost. We have lost confidence in ourselves. And he said those famous words, which I think are very well known, and that is, the only thing we really have to fear is fear itself. And he said, next Monday I'm going to open the banks again. There was a 1-week banking holiday. And I want you all to go back to the banks, but this time I want you to redeposit your money. America was founded on a confidence in ourselves and that we can make a better future. And if we act out of fear, we will only destroy what we've created. We've got to act out of that truth that made us prosperous. With great trepidation, the Banking Commission opened all the banks the next Monday morning. The lines lined up again, just as they had the previous week, but the majority of the people were depositing their money rather than withdrawing it, and the banking crisis ended with that. And then in the New Deal, legislation was put in place to protect the depositors' money, all of which was dismantled about 15 years ago, but to separate the commercial and the investment banks. And we had 70 years of great banking, financial stability in the banking system in the U.S. I'm giving this as an example to illustrate how powerful our expectations or anticipation of the future is in determining how our society operates. And with that, I would like to make some theoretical comments on the status of the social sciences today and why I think anticipation is so important, and how I hope to see a change and an evolution in the social sciences in the future. And this first point, I'm not going to dwell on because it was already elaborated by several of the speakers this morning, our conception of the social sciences has been very much based on, inherited from the phenomenal success of natural sciences over the previous 200 years. And some of the assumptions that we take for granted in the social sciences as given really come out of that heritage and need to be revisited. One of them is the sense that our social systems run by mechanistic laws, what I would call Newtonian laws, the way the natural world and the world of physics runs. That our society is subject to immutable laws of nature, natural laws. In the physical, natural world, there is a good deal of complexity. But when you think about the complexity of the social life, the natural sciences have a very easy job in trying to get to reality. Even when you go into the complexity of subatomic particles and everything, nothing to compare, because there you're only talking about the complexity of physical things, which all have their own characteristic forms of behavior. Here we're talking about the interaction of living, conscious individuals who don't all behave the same way, and don't behave the same way from one moment to another in one place or another. So we have a life reality and we have a mental consciousness that distinguishes us from the subatomic particles or the elements, which is often neglected when we try to look at social sciences in terms of statistical averages and so forth. If you look at the natural sciences, there is a natural interdependence and interdisciplinarity between them, in the obvious sense that it doesn't matter whether you're a geologist or a meteorologist or a geneticist or an ecologist. The laws of physics work for everybody. The laws of chemistry work for everybody. Whether it's inorganic or organic chemistry, we don't change the rules. But when it comes to the natural sciences, we'd be hard-pressed to think of any law of psychology or sociology or economics or political science or anthropology that is uniformly accepted by the others. It's as if we're talking about different realities, not a hierarchy of realities, of interdependent realities. This is one of the reasons, and this point was mentioned this morning. The natural sciences are naturally focusing on reality as an object, because that's about the only way we can know it. We can study electrons, we can study different species, we can study planets and environments, but we have no way of getting into. We don't know that they have any subjective reality of their own, or that they're acting on any subjective basis. But the social sciences, we are at least as much, I would argue, more subjective beings than we are responding to objective conditions. And a social science that doesn't take into account that subjective reality cannot handle the complexity of the reality we're facing. The natural sciences, and again these points were spoken this morning, is essentially deterministic to the, leaving out quantum mechanics, but essentially is looking at the forces and factors and conditions of the past that have determined the present and are going to determine the future. Whereas in the social sciences, as our discussion this morning suggested, our perception of the future, our anticipation, our aspiration, our expectation, our understanding, our illusions, our fears are very much a determinant. And that's why I gave the example of FDR, because the people who feared that if they don't take their money out, they're going to lose it all, in one day they changed their perception and they changed their behavior based on a different conception of the future. So what we have been doing within the World Academy is been asking ourselves, can we conceptualize a new or a new paradigm in the social sciences, which we would call a transdisciplinary social science, that would overcome what we see are the limitations of basing ourselves entirely on a heritage from the natural sciences. And the premises behind that would include that the laws governing society are not natural, immutable laws of nature. They're man-made, they're human-made. They're based on the institutions we create, they're based on the values, they're based on the policies, and the laws work in one way or another according to implicit assumptions, premises, and values which we often take for granted in practice. We believe if we go below the level of disciplinary fragmentation or separation, that there is a common basis. There are common principles that would be relevant to all the social sciences. And one of the things that excites us about anticipation is because the very fact that we're having this conference illustrates the fact that here's a topic where we can all talk together. We all have something to relate to this topic of human perceptions in time and our understanding of the future and its impact on the present and on future outcomes. At the same time, it also necessarily means if we are impacting that what we think, what we feel, what we value, what we want really matters, and the reality is not just an objective reality that can be dealt with according to universal laws. I mentioned this morning, and this example of FDR, along with the one I mentioned of Churchill and Gorbachev, also suggests the fact that we cannot treat every individual as similar, that every individual, being a conscious person, is capable of unique responses. Some of those individuals are actually helping us map the future and change that future. Others are either going along with it or resisting it. But we have to look at the individual in all our social sciences as an undeniable reality who cannot just be grouped into statistical averages. So, what does this have to do with anticipation? I'd like to make a distinction, and I think we have a long way to go in developing a set of definitions that we're all going to be comfortable with. But the topic came up in Reel Miller's presentation this morning, between our belief or understanding or thoughts about the future and our desires or aspirations or intentions about the future. And I think one of the questions we need to discuss, that's why I put it back to Riel after his presentation, is where do these two things come into a discipline of anticipation? Is anticipation only a question of a better understanding of what's going to happen, or an understanding that we can't know what's going to happen, or a clear understanding of the role that we as human beings have in determining what's going to happen, whether it's in our economic system or our social system or a legal or political system or something like that. What I thought I heard this morning, and I'm putting it up as a topic for debate, what I thought I heard this morning was a lot about that how we understand, making more explicit the premises, understandings, values on which we are anticipating or projecting we think the future will come. But we kind of left the human being out of this. We kind of left the determinative role of the human being. And I think that's a leftover from the the natural sciences, where we're trying to observe a reality independent of ourselves. There is no reality independent of ourselves, and that's what FDR really illustrated when he realized it's not about figuring out what's going to happen with the economy, it's about deciding what's going to happen with it and figuring out how to motivate people to make that happen. So that's why I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think ultimately, maybe we're very far to go on that, but ultimately we'll be looking at a social sciences which brings us back into intimate relationship with what we're studying. The academic, the separation between the scientist and the subject matter, which is still there. We're somehow thinking we can deal with it independently. But I think if we really understand anticipation in this sense, we'll see that we are not only trying to understand reality, but we're also trying to understand what our role is and how we can impact on that reality. The way we understand it is one of the things that's going to impact on it, but there's something else also, what we're going to do about it, what we're going to will, what we're going to decide, what we're going to aspire for as a result of that. One of the topics which we have not gone into yet is the role of values. In the World Academy, we've been trying to really understand what is this thing we call values and what is its impact on, and you're going to tell me I have 2 minutes left, right? 5 minutes left. Okay, thank you. 5 minutes, I have plenty of time there. In 1861, Franklin D. Roosevelt became the President of the United States, and with immediately, in fact, before he could, after his election and before he could get to the White House, the southern states withdrew from the Union and declared themselves as an independent confederacy. I guess you'd call it an act of anticipation, because they anticipated that once he becomes president, that he's going to move to reduce or eliminate the spread of slavery not in their states, but in the new territories that had not yet become states, and they were trying to get them to adopt slavery too. When you look at it historically, it looks so bizarre when you see from a historical perspective that 13 states really thought they were ready to die for the preservation of slavery. And if you look it up in the Wikipedia and you look at the history of the abolitionist movement, you can see from 1700, that is 160 years earlier, virtually every year, there was a significant movement in the world, most of them in Europe, but not exclusively in Europe, some in the US as well, where countries first abolished the slave trade, second, abolished slavery at home. Third, abolished slavery in their own colonies. So if you look at it historically, the idea that people should be free looks like it was inevitable. It looked like the movement for freedom was inevitable. My point was that anyone who had a historical perspective would have seen in 1776, we signed the Declaration of Independence, in which it said that every man, or a man, it's just not women, but we were all created equal and endowed with an inalienable rights. Of course, half of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders. But they all knew that slavery had to go. Many of them were anxious. Washington decreed that at his death all the slaves would be freed, and so forth and so on. But how could these people have 70 years later been thinking about trying to preserve slavery and extend it somewhere else? So there was a deep driver here that was very powerful. And there was a movement. We can call it the value of freedom and equality. You can call it by whatever name. You can trace it. Even in Russia, slavery had been abolished before in the U.S. Even in India, there had been legally at least, elimination of indentured. It took 100 years more for the American Civil Rights Movement to make real a lot of what was decided by the Civil War. It took longer for apartheid to be ended in South Africa. But what is this thing that we call a value? If it isn't an aspiration that's been accepted by humanity, that is gradually growing in power, we may accept it mentally before we accept it physically. I may know, yes, everybody should be free, but I have a certain advantage with things the way they are. But if we look historically, we see there are deep drivers that have been realizing themselves, that have been working themselves out. And it'd be very interesting to look at history in terms of what those deep drivers are, and see how that relates to the topic of anticipation.